Welcome, everyone, to the Meet the Funder panel. My name is Angela Richardson. I will be your host for today. If you've been joining us for these last funder panels, you know that each time we have an illustrious group of funders from all over the country, and today is no different. So I'm really excited to introduce them to you. So before that, my name is Angela Richardson. Again, those of you that are just joining us, I'm a senior trainer here at the Grantsmanship Center. And the Grantsmanship Center, if this is your first time to us, our mission is to help private and public nonprofits make better communities. And we do that by offering training and publications to help organizations plan solid programs and write logical and compelling grant proposals and create earned income opportunities. So if you're new to us, make sure that at some point you check out our website and check out what we're up to. There's a lot of resources that are available to you, including today's webinar panel. I also want to give a shout out to we have two partners in this funder panel. So Foundant Technologies and GrantStation, which is a wonderful database for looking for grant makers. So thank you to our partners for helping us bring everything that it takes together to offer this to the nonprofit sector. Next, I want to introduce our panel. So we have a very illustrious panel they're going to jump on one at a time. And the first person I want to introduce is Sol Anderson. Sol is the president of community investment at Evanston Community Foundation. They're Illinois, and they support nonprofit organizations, schools, and government agencies that address the community needs in their area, which is Evanston, Illinois. Next, so welcome, Sol. Thank you for being here with us today. Next up is Gina Stilp. Gina is the Gina comes to us from the Zilber Family Foundation, and which is dedicated to enhancing the well-being of individuals, families, and neighborhoods with a primary emphasis in Milwaukee, and from what I understand, Hawaii as well. So hopefully she'll tell us a little bit about her foundation and their focus and what they're up to these days. And then finally is Tim Greseth. He's the executive director at the Oregon Wildlife Foundation, and they're based in Portland, Oregon, and they're dedicated to conserving fish, wildlife, and the natural habitat in Oregon. So as you can see, we've got panelists from all over the country that do very different kinds of work, and that's really what we're going to focus on during our time together. So this is a Meet the Grantmakers panel. It's an opportunity for you all, the grant sector, to hear from these different panelists and ask questions live. So we have a couple of questions that came in ahead of time, and we will also be taking some live questions. My colleague Linda is in the chat, is moderating that. So go ahead and start putting your questions in there, and she'll be sending them to us as they come. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping things, of course. We are recording today's session. So yes, you'll get the recording, that always comes up. We have auto captioning available, and you can just click on the bottom with a C if you need that function. And with that, we're going to get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is ask the panelists to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their foundation, what kind of foundation they are, what they focus on. You all will receive a very detailed profile of them. So they'll tell us some of their focuses right now. And then after that, we'll jump into some questions. So I'm going to ask you to please start us off.
Yeah, hello, I'm Sol Anderson. Quick correction, I'm actually the president and CEO of the Evanston Community Foundation.
Sorry about that.
No worries, we had our vice president on the most important contact, so that, just wanted to put that out there, partially because our vice president knows way more than me, and I don't want to be held to that same standard. So again, we're from Evanston Community Foundation. Evanston is a community just north of the city of Chicago, actually borders the south end of Evanston, borders the Rogers Park neighborhood in Chicago. A really diverse, both economically, racially, community in here. We're also home to Northwestern University, which is how most people know Evanston. Our focus is, certainly to support the entire community of Evanston. Our mission is to create a vibrant, inclusive, and equitable Evanston. I would also add to that just as we are starting to work, think about what how our work moves beyond equity and starts to move into repairing harm done to marginalized communities, specifically the African-American community, which has a long history in Evanston. And we were actually the first municipality to pass reparations legislation in American history, which just passed last year. And we're working out all of the things that come with that. So a lot of great things happening in Evanston, and I'm glad to share more as the conversation progresses.
Thank you so much. And I think you're saying Saul, and I've been saying Soul. So I
apologize. No worries.
For that as well.
I kind of tune that. Over years, I know some people say it's Soul, so I tune it out. But it is Saul, like S-A-U-L. It's probably the more accurate pronunciation. But no worries.
Thank you. Appreciate your generosity with that. Next up is Gina Stilp.
I am the executive director of the Zilber Family Foundation headquartered in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Saul, I'm glad to hear you've moved into Rogers Park. I'm a Loyola alum, and so lived in Rogers Park for 5 years. But here in Milwaukee, the Zilber Family Foundation has been working since the late 60s. In our most current iteration, for about the past 15 years, we have been a real place-based funder. We launched a neighborhood initiative in Milwaukee that was modeled on much work that had been done in Chicago with LISC. And so the way we work is we go into neighborhoods that we have identified in partnership with our stakeholders and community partners. We work with resident stakeholder groups to develop quality of life plans for resident and community groups to vision the future that they see for their communities. And then we work in partnership with them, with our many partners across sectors, to implement the strategies that have been developed at that grassroots level. More recently, we have focused on two primary issues in that work. One is affordable housing, and the other is community economic development. And so we're very focused on increasing the economic viability and prosperity of families who live in the geographies where we work and serve. As Angela mentioned, we also have a smaller portfolio in Oahu and Hawaii. Our board has sort of moved all over the country in the past couple of generations. And so the family is still on my board. I have 4 family members who participate as this family foundation, and they all currently spend some or most or all of their time on Oahu. So we do about $1 million a year of grant making in the Hawaii area. And that's primarily for basic human needs. We work closely with the homeless population, houseless population, and I'm kind of moving into the youth development and housing arena as we go forward. So it's so great to be here, and I really look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Gina. Tim?
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Oregon Wildlife Foundation is an operating charitable foundation, so perhaps a little bit different than the two you just heard from, in that we have to raise our budget every year. No portion of staff costs or operating expenses is endowed. So I'll be listening intently, both as a panelist and as a participant to what my fellow panelists are saying, because we need to raise our budget every year as well. We have 4 programs primarily to help support conservation work in the state of Oregon. And the state of Oregon is the limitation, large limitation for us. We don't do any cross-border funding, but we have a grant making program. In addition to that, we're also a fiscal sponsor of grassroots community efforts to conserve wildlife around the state of Oregon. We have 9 fiscally sponsored projects. We also run capital campaigns to try to raise money for larger project initiatives, bigger projects that require a heavier lift. And then we're starting to become more engaged in land conservation and land stewardship. So we're accepting our first conservation easement this year, and we'll be looking for more opportunities to support that kind of work around the state of Oregon moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tim. Welcome, all of you. It never ceases to amaze me how diverse our panelists are in terms of the kind of foundations you all represent, where you work, and all of that. So I'm looking forward to diving in. I'm going to start with Gina. I'm going to put the first question to you, and then we'll go around, but feel free to have this be a conversation that you can pass or jump on or add more. I think that participants really get a lot from hearing how what you all have to share. So the first question that came in, Gina, and that comes in almost every single panel we do, is what would you say is some of the do's and don'ts when it comes to building relationships with grant makers? So many of us, grant seekers, we're out there, we're doing our prospecting and finding these different foundations. What would you say are some things that you've seen or experienced as a do or and a don't?
Well, I will start by saying my first career was in fund development. And so I've been on both sides of the table. And I think it's really helped me as a grant maker have just a deeper well of empathy for how difficult it can be to build those relationships. I do recall that feeling of, if it's a closed application cycle, if the email address and phone number aren't on the website, that was sort of a sign not to reach out and wait for people to call me as a fundraiser. And I would say that really shaped, I think, my philosophy now, which is we're here as a partner. I think particularly when you're, a family foundation, when you are rooted in a community, when you've made a long-term commitment to a place or to a set of issues, that it's really our responsibility to be meeting with community members and with nonprofit organizations. And so I always err on the side of, I think what you said, Angela, is so important, relationship. There is definitely still a lot of work to do to go from an unknown entity to a grantee of an organization. But I think it has to be really about relational work. And so I always think about, a warm handoff is a warm introduction is always a benefit. So do your homework. I think if you're looking to start that relationship, find a way in where there's either another organization that the foundation is currently funded that you're affiliated with or partnering with, or if there's a board member on your board who knows a board member on my board, that's regularly a way to sort of make sure that meeting takes place. So I do think it's those warm introductions can really be the best way to go from a cold call to a phone call. And so, those are the ways that I think that you can get started.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much. Tim, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure I could add much other than it really is important to me and to us to learn what their questions are. And so I want to encourage people who are interested in seeking funding from the Oregon Wildlife Foundation to give me a call or send me an email. We don't have any prohibitions against, we don't have people don't have to be invited to apply. It's an open process for us. And I really actually enjoy the questions I receive. And it does help me help grantees tailor their application to what our priorities are. And I think I don't want to waste my time and I don't want them to waste theirs. So we certainly encourage lots of questions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Saul?
Yeah, I would just add, and this is my first foray into the foundation world as well. I spent most of my time, leading community-based organizations largely on the south side of Chicago for the past several years in Inglewood and Bronzeville. And so, certainly have dealt with the fundraising piece also being geographically distant from where the seat of power is in Chicago and where most of the money is. Apologies. I have an L track right behind my office. So if it cuts out, it's like, so yeah. But if I could cut out at all, but I would say, Evanston's a relatively small community. It's like 8 square miles, 75,000 people. So it's kind of hard for us to not know what's going on in community, right? And there's such a deep kind of connectedness within this community. But I think, we've had a lot of good do's. I would say just a couple of, gentle don'ts are, I think oftentimes what kind of happens, as you see in the case of like a decline or something like that, I think, the relationship up front is very important. I would say you don't want to over leverage that relationship in a situation where you get bad news, right? I think that makes it, difficult for staff to feel like they can have really honest conversations with folks who are declined. If perhaps you're a neighbor or you go to the same church or congregation as a board member, and the program just isn't a right fit, and then it ends up kind of making the relationship more strained and more troubled than it needs to be. So I think if your focus is really on building relationships, collaborating with other organizations that are doing good work, and really building a relationship with our team, because our team is in community going to, we are the fiscal sponsor for the Cradle to Career initiative here in Evanston. We're regularly present at city council meetings and small collaborative meetings around specific issue areas, and we're partners there. So you're going to run into us at some point. And so like really focusing on building a relationship at that level goes even farther than reaching out to a board member, or even to me. I don't have the depth of knowledge that, my staff would in specific issue areas. And so that relationship first, but don't kind of over leverage a relationship that might hold more power. Not that it won't necessarily, it certainly doesn't mean a decline necessarily, but it does make the relationship more fraught than it needs to be.
That's a really good point. And it's so interesting to hear how all three of you answer. I'm noticing in the chat, some folks are asking about, different geographic areas. And I just want to put out there that I always teach in the training, when one foundation, exactly one foundation. So what, these folks are speaking to are the things that they do in their area, and they're kind of representing, a family foundation, an operating foundation, a community foundation, but really in their area. So there's things that we can take away from this, that you may kind of begin to look at the community foundation or the operating foundations or family foundations in your area to see how they might be similar or different. So I really am appreciating, certainly with family foundations, and even with Tim, you're like, call me, and, find relationships. And then, Saul is like, well, but don't over leverage it. So taking all of this and thinking about who your foundations are and what's the best way to approach them. There's not a cookie cutter way. And we're starting to, hear that from our panelists. So I want to, a lot of times when organizations that come to our trainings, and also certainly this panel, they're newer organizations. So maybe smaller organizations, and smaller, I'm going to say under an annual operating budget, let's say of under $50,000 a year. Maybe they haven't been around for more than 5 years. And so from your perspective, and Tim, I'm going to start with you this time. What are some of your advice or some tips that you have for newer organizations that are beginning to apply for grant funding?
Yeah, no, I thank you. I appreciate that question. We're more project-driven funding than we are operational funding, so it's a little bit different for us. I think I would say for a newer organization or more of a startup organization is to make sure you're really familiar with the grant giving guidelines of whomever you're approaching. I sometimes I think in the desire to get the funding you need, you sometimes overlook things that are going to sink your application because you didn't read the guidelines very carefully. So it's great to have energy and enthusiasm, but make sure you've sort of done your homework. And then again, I strongly encourage, and we've heard that I think already, build that relationship. So reach out, make a phone call, send an email, and that familiarity certainly helps when the application comes through.
Thank you, Saul.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that we've been particularly aware of here in our community, and I know this, being an African-American nonprofit leader, so we see, not only with new organizations, but in particular with new organizations led by people of color who don't necessarily have access to like personal networks that might help you kind of launch an organization, is that we need to be really responsive to the needs of these smaller organizations. We saw a number of organizations, grow up during the early days of the pandemic, responding to needs that were not being met by our social services infrastructure at that time. we can't let those die if they're literally saving people's lives during, the worst pandemic of our lifetime, right? So we created a grant cycle called E-Town Innovations, which is really about helping organizations that don't necessarily have that long track record, and providing them with some support to launch things, particularly kind of projects or initiatives, or if your work is focused on building equity, or if you take a real racial equity stance in sort of the formation of your organization, staff, board construction, but even just your sort of like programmatic approach has an equity lens on it. So we've created some pathways for folks like that. I would also say a unique thing about a community foundation is that we're actually also able to hold donor advised funds. And I'd say, the largest sort of donor advised fund holders typically are financial institutions. I believe in terms of dollars in, dollars out, Fidelity Charitable is the largest foundation in the US, if not the world. But there's donor advised funds, but they can be a little bit of a harder nut to crack. Like, you don't just go and say, hey, Fidelity Charitable, who funds what I care about? But we can actually do that at the community foundation level, right? We can connect our donors to things that they care about, our donor advised fund holders, to issues that they care about, organizations that we believe in or that we think have the potential to make some change, even if they don't have that long track record. And that really helps, even for folks who don't have their 501c3 application yet. The laws are sort of shifting, and there's some things going through Congress now about what community foundations can do in this regard. But if you get a donor advised fund grant, it comes as a grant from us, ECF, in partnership with this fund, and that can help you meet, your public funding criteria as a 501c3, because we draw funds from a variety of different sources. So, there's specific legality in that. This is not blanket recommendations. It's just sort of that's an opportunity to pursue. So if you have a community foundation in your community, that's a great conversation to have, because they may have individual donors who hold funds who care just about what you're focused on. And that's a great way to kind of start out and build a champion, because often those fund holders have other resources available to support your organization as well.
That's so good. Could you just explain for those people out there who may be new to the community foundation world, what you mean by a donor advised fund? I think that's something, I always say community foundations are some of my favorites. I keep saying I'm going to get a t-shirt that says I Heart Community Foundations, because they are I think sometimes an overlooked resource in when we're grant seeking. So could you just quickly explain for someone out there who doesn't know what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the I think the primary difference is, rather than having like a family or an individual endow a foundation, community foundations are typically endowed by raising funds from the whole community. We actually do annual fundraising as well for a portion of our budget, although we are, in part covered by our endowment draw as well. And we are able to draw, it's really between 3 and 6%. We typically draw 5% of our endowment to kind of cover different pieces. And then we also hold funds that are sort of structured differently. So we have our unrestricted endowment, which is roughly a quarter of our overall endowment. And then we can have board controlled endowments. There was an initiative here in Illinois many years back called Community Works that allowed for grants around workforce development, early childhood development, and land use. That's board controlled. It's not unrestricted, but our board makes the decisions about how that's leveraged. So we get to use that in certain circumstances. And then we have a smattering of other funds that are either field of interest funds. So if someone cares deeply about environmental issues, they can set a fund there that can be used to make grants specifically for that. Or there are donor advised funds, which is where a donor says, I'm going to put, a pool of money. Most community foundations have a low limit. Ours is $10,000, where you set a pool of funds aside, and then you make recommendations to the foundation every year about what grants you want to fund out of that donor advised fund. Technically, legally, the foundation controls those dollars, so we can say yes or no to certain grants, but we don't typically do that because it's just not good business to say, yes, we know you gave us your money, but we're not making a grant to this thing that you care about, unless it's things that just absolutely do not align with our values, or, from our perspective, with values that we think that anyone should have, right? We're not going to fund, hate groups because you want to put some money into one from a donor advised fund or anything like that. So that's just a little bit of the nuance structure, but that's how we kind of fit that publicly funded initiative, is because our money comes from the community, and we pool it either into our annual fund in some cases, but also into our endowment. So virtually every dollar we have in our endowment right now was raised from the entire community of Evanston, which makes us sort of an opportunity for public funding. It's like it's too blanket a statement, but kind of a one-stop shop for those options in some cases for organizations.
Thank you. Thank you, Saul, for clarifying that. Appreciate it. And Gina, so we were talking about new organizations and, advice you might have for newer organizations applying to your foundation.
Yeah, so I think it really does depend on the foundation. Like you said earlier, we really prioritize capacity building and operating support as foundational for the success of organizations and a really strong nonprofit community. So we do a number of things with smaller organizations. I think instead of the typical, things we might look to go through our due diligence process, we really look at leadership. So do you have someone in place who has a track record of success in some way, shape, or form as a community leader, as an executive, as a resident organizer, some connection to the place or the issue. We also really look for some evidence that there's a clear vision. So while you may not have a track record of success in terms of outputs, outcomes, to really know where you want to go would be another important indicator for us. And then I think a connection to the population that you're serving. So if we don't have a really strong track record, we'd look to say, wow, you were born and raised in this community that you've now started to work in. And so you have this organic, connection to this place, to these people, to this culture. And so that would be, another way for us to sort of proxy measure a new established organization, a new not established organization versus one that's been around for 50 years doing great work. And I think when we look at what we would fund for those newer organizations, we really try and encourage groups to identify, what do you need to get from A to B in this life cycle? So from a startup organization to that next step forward, is it building your board out? Is it understanding what fund development looks like? Is it doing an organization assessment, getting your policies in place? Having consultant support come in. So our team loves to kind of problem solve with those newer organizations to think through the variety of options. It may not just be, I want to get this program started, but is there some additional work you need to really lay that strong foundation so that you can, fulfill your mission and fulfill those bigger projects and programs on your radar.
So this is kind of gonna pick up on something you guys have been talking about. There's questions coming up in the chat. And I think this is only going to maybe just apply to you, Gina, because I think the other you all have open. Well, maybe you saw. So I'll ask the question. Gussie wants to know, other than having a previous relationship with a funder, how do you acquire an invitation to apply? So Gina, I believe you have.
We have a couple different pathways in. So it kind of depends. Our historically, because we're a very relational foundation, we would usually go to the organizations with whom we've worked the longest or who helped lead the community organizing, the resident engagement piece, the development of a strategy. And we usually use our grantees as our eyes and ears. So what frequently happens for us is if an organization we don't know who works on housing calls and says, we really want to work on down payment assistance and home buyer education programs, and we think we could really work in the geographies where you serve, our first line of recommendation is usually, please go talk to these 3 organizations that we already work with. And sort of use them as a way to say, can you partner? Are you offering similar services, different services? How do you fit into what the residents or the community members in that place are already interested in pursuing? And then I think we sort of use those groups as our recommendations. So that is another way where we might extend an invitation to a group, really based on our current partners' experience and recommendations to us.
That's such an important point. I think oftentimes when we think about approaching funders, we're not always putting our attention on things like, what do my colleagues think about our work, or what do they know about our organization? And that's just, I think, a way that we as grant seekers don't always think about in terms of finding ways to develop relationship with funders. That's such a great point. So Tim, I think you guys are open. You have open applications, right? So they don't have to figure out a way to get invited to apply. Is that right? Okay.
That's correct.
Yeah. And then Saul, there was another question that came in that is sort of in this vein, which is, when seeking funding from a community foundation, does an applicant specifically request funds from a certain donor advised fund, or is the role of the community foundation to match or align it with the recipient? And how do they help bring themselves to your attention to get matched, if that's the possibility?
Yeah, so we have two sort of pathways. So first of all, if you have, again, Evanston being a relatively small community, if you have a relationship with a donor advised fund holder, and we've had this, happen in the past, our funds are listed on the website, so you can see many of the funds that we have in place. And if there's alignment, you can reach out to those folks if you know them. We don't always do the direct match. What we do is we have a grant making partners process. And so we have open applications. We have a couple of, 4 cycles per year. And then we have some sort of discretionary grants that we make as certain initiatives come up. And then we take our kind of top rated proposals. I've been trying not to eyeball the chat too much, but I saw the power imbalance piece. And, one of the things that we've done is we actually bring community members from all walks of life onto our grant review committees to rate and review, so that, and, I've been on them. We have staff, we have board members. We also have folks who just live in the neighborhood, right? And there's no respect to income or position. We just sort of invite people to come, and organizations send us representatives who are participants in their programs. And so we take those most highly rated proposals to our to donor advised fund holders to make grants from their donor advised funds, or DAFs. That's how we typically refer to them. So if I say that, I don't want to, confuse anyone, but like DAF holders would then, could make that grant. And then when you get that grant, you can see, this grant was made by ECF in partnership with this fund holder. And then there's opportunities to build relationship from there. We don't typically say, in very rare cases would we say, oh, you should go to this donor advised fund. It has, happened on occasion in special circumstances, but that's not really the best way to pursue. I think, again, it's just about the collaboration, the partnership, getting in front of the foundation through a grant review process. And then we would kind of offer the opportunity for donor advice, for DAF holders to review grants, review proposals that they might be interested in funding.
That's great. Thank you. There's a couple questions coming up about, Jane asks, if you don't hear back from a foundation, what is the preferred way to follow up on a grant application, and how long should you wait? And there's another question that says, kind of wants to know about the post process. So if you get denied, we oftentimes teach, like, just because you get a no doesn't mean no forever, just means maybe not right now or not this cycle. So I think that, in general terms, if you all could just speak to when an application is denied, how long should you wait? What are some of your advice for following up? Do you do phone calls about how they can make their applications better? Things like that. Tim, would you start us off?
Yeah, I'm happy to start things off. Well, I mean, so I think the short answer is we try to follow up really quickly after any grant process is concluded, and we do our grant making on a quarterly basis. So we have a project committee that reviews all applications that come through. It's a large group. We have 26 people on our project committee. Not all participate in every meeting, but we have a large group that looks at it. As Saul mentioned, it's people who have very different perspectives, perhaps, to bring on the projects. But we let people know, in most cases, within a couple of days of that evaluation process, what the outcome was. And in the off chance that we've declined a request for funding, we list a reason. And we invite further questions and conversations. So sometimes that happens. Sometimes people will follow up and say, well, this is really important to us. How can we reapply in the next quarter, or the cycle next year at the same time? And I'm happy. We are happy, always happy to have a conversation with people about ways to improve or help them understand how they may be misunderstood the guidelines that we have on our grant site. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Gina?
Yeah, I can offer. So our process is probably a little different because we don't always have big open cycles. So generally speaking, even if we have invited an application, my program staff works really closely with the applicants to develop an application that we think is the most compelling and that will meet our requirements and our guidelines and the strategy that we've set out. So if we read the application up front and say like, wow, we really don't understand the program, we don't understand the outcomes, the budget isn't making sense to us, we'll start asking those questions before we close the application so that we're bringing the best request forward to our board of directors for decision. On the occasion where we have declined, we had a special cycle for COVID that was an open application. We released an additional $3 million for both emergency response and for just general operating. And we did have one decline. And it was honestly one of the best and the hardest conversations that I've had as a grant maker. It was a group of African-American leaders in our community working on health equity issues. And they really felt that our process was not open, wasn't transparent, that there was not clear criteria as to how we were evaluating the grant proposal that they had put forward. And we responded with, well, these are the questions that we asked in ourselves. This was the evaluation criteria that we were using. One of which was, who else are you working with? And that's for us really important is, what other partnerships do you have in the community? And they said to us, well, the partners that you want us to have are the partners that we don't want to work with, that we find to have institutional racism involved in them. You want us to work with, essentially the white establishment on health equity. And we are trying to, really make sure that the community knows that there is a community of color here that wants to work on these issues and that we really felt that your process was not transparent and racist. And so in that situation, we had, I think it was healing and growing for us to be able to have that. It forced us and my team to have a lot of reflection. We still ask them for a set of questions and another response. And after, many back and forths, we did end up funding that organization for the initial purpose. But I think the example there is like, don't be afraid. We did not know we were making a mistake and we learned a lot from that. So I think, it's, follow up right away, get feedback right away, make sure that you're telling the story and telling your experience with foundations, because we have a lot of work to do to be more equitable, more transparent organizations. And I'm so thankful that organization had the courage really to call and say, no, it's not acceptable to us and here's why. So I'll leave it there, but
yeah, no, that's really great. And it actually even pulls in this other question that came up around power dynamics, conversations with foundations to change, how we're all in the process of, we're in an unprecedented time. How do we address some of these things? And so I appreciate what you just shared. And I think one of the takeaways for the grant seekers out there is, ask the questions, follow up. Don't, what you just said, Gina, don't be afraid to, to speak up, to ask the question, to try to reach out and get in touch. So, so I appreciate that. Saul?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I really appreciated that perspective from Gina. Again, I talked about this earlier, but like we know that fundraisers of color, in particular Black fundraisers, like the research is pretty clear, raise fewer dollars with more restrictions than their white counterparts, right? So those kind of conversations are incredibly important to have, right? To know, we like bias is baked into our world. We think about these things. We have to, really think about like, are we assuming certain things about the competence of an organization in order to execute on this program and these sort of things, or not having these clear markers for ourselves. So I think those conversations are incredibly important. And I just wanted to, to say that for our grant makers and our grant seekers, if you're not, who are participating in this call, like on the grant seeking side, knowing that that's the case, that sometimes smaller organizations like keep plugging away. I personally, if you don't hear back from one of our team, that's something I actually would like to hear. That is, when I want to hear from, that's happening. I have not heard that that's been the case, but maybe it is. For our grant makers, I think who are here. So those are incredibly important conversations to have internally, and to take that feedback and figure out like, are we actually doing something wrong? Are we doing something that's not just, based because of how we're structured or because of how we see the world based. Like we're part of the institution as foundations, whether we're, trying to make change or not, right? Like we are gathering places for wealth. You know what I mean? Like that's just what we are. And so we've got to wrestle with that internally continually and not be afraid to say that we messed up and change things.
Thank you. This is kind of connected to this conversation that's just kind of risen up from Gina's response, which is that foundations are now asking for DEI policies in programming, et cetera. And it says, we're not sure how to address this as a small organization with a minimal staff. Our mission is to help anyone who needs help. So I wonder if any of the panelists could speak to, I know, Saul, you had mentioned that you guys have a tool that you have there, or I don't know if that's something that, some of the other foundations, and I wonder if there's anyone who could speak to that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, right, like we want to see growth towards it. We want to see, change over time. Again, being part of a smaller community does help us see if these things are changing. I think this is also another space where we need to look internally. Like if you're asking an organization for a DEI statement and you don't have any board members of color, maybe it's time to do some self-checking before we start asking other people to move forward, like since we're supposed to be leaders in that space. And then, I also think having voices of folks from marginalized communities at the table when you're making decisions about grants is important too, because then you're going to get a better perspective on how this work is actually going to impact the communities that talking about. Like that's the real measure of equity for me. It's like, are we making this community work for everybody involved? And that means investing in initiatives that are going to strengthen community. Yes, we want board structure to look, to look more balanced. We want staff structure to look more balanced. A lot of those things are actually products of the broader world that we, can't necessarily fix from a small organization, right? Like board members give money. Money does not sit in the hands of people of color, generally speaking. It's incredibly challenging. We want to see a path that you're walking on. We want to see requests for support. We want to see, that sort of digging in. But I don't think it has to be perfection. I think it has to be, somebody who's walking the path earnestly. And then, we also, again, want to look internally about the ways that we're evaluating grants to make sure that we're not, looking at equity through a white dominant lens of what equity is supposed to look like, because that happens too. So, it's complex, right? Just like solving these issues are globally, right? Like we didn't get to this place where, our world is unequal, like in a week, hundreds and hundreds of years to get here. So we got to walk the path together and fix ourselves concurrently. So, the community having a broader array of voices weigh in on grants, I think is one way that we're tackling that to make sure that we're, understanding how these organizations are actually functioning within our neighborhoods. But there's more work that we need to do as well.
Thank you for that. Anybody else want to weigh in on that question?
I would just add, I really appreciate, Saul, that you said that, foundations need to take a hard look at themselves before they start asking nonprofits for information. And as Mr. Zilber, Joe Zilber, who started our foundation, is Caucasian. My board are his family members and his colleagues from business for many years. And so I have a predominantly white board of directors. And so again, I think, Saul, you said it really well. I mean, we want to make sure organizations are on a journey. We also have to acknowledge that we are very early in our journey of an internal racial equity lens policy commitment. And so we are doing the work. We've just, we're starting the work now. But I think we can't put expectations on an entity if we're not going to walk the walk ourselves. And so we really try and use trusted partners, entities outside of ourselves to help us with that vetting so that we are minimizing the white perspective, the white dominating perspective on those questions and concerns, knowing that we're very imperfect in that way.
Sort of ties to that, what you said too about maybe even asking the question, like if a statement is required, then, that can be a dialogue between a grant seeker and a grant maker. So it's a great opening. Tim, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Just that I'm listening to the panelists and appreciating their perspectives.
Yeah, thank you. Me too. I think our group is as well. There's lots of questions coming in. I'm going to shift perspective, shift focus right now. And this one's going to move over towards multi-year grants. Whether and how your foundations look upon funding a nonprofit, an organization year after year. Do you do multi-year awards? As a grant seeker, if I'm applying again, what advice do you have for me around that? So how does your foundation look upon multi-year grant awards? And Tim, I'm going to ask you to start us off again.
Sure. Our Oregon Wildlife Foundation does not make multi-year awards, so this isn't really a question for us. I will say that we have on occasion with partners work together on projects that span multiple years, but it's not in the context of our grant making process. So I'm not a good source of information about that.
Do you, just to follow up there, do you do for an organization, what's your policy around if we receive an award this year, can we apply again, or do you require a break?
Yeah, no, we might be a little bit different in that way. As our requirement is a final report and invoices is what closes out a grant, and so if we have a organization that's nimble and efficient, they could certainly be eligible for more than one award in a given fiscal year.
And do you look for them to have a different kind of programs? Because I think a lot of times nonprofits, if we are starting to develop a relationship with a funder, we think we need to reinvent ourselves or offer something new, or even if it's not a multi-year, like we want to apply to them again because it's a good fit. How does your foundation look upon that?
That's interesting. We certainly don't expect that. The work in the environmental restoration, habitat improvement area is pretty straightforward. I think we're not always looking for innovation necessarily. What we're looking for are projects with solid outcomes. And oftentimes we do work with a number of different state agencies, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, federal agencies, U.S. Forest Service, and the Bureau of Land Management. And so we will look to our agency partners for advice to put projects in context and to verify, I guess, to some degree that the proposal that we're looking at and intending to fund is going to be impactful, and others can vouch for that, not just us. But no, we're not looking for organizations to reinvent themselves. Frankly, we appreciate the good work of a number of partners that we have funded year in and year out for projects, and what we know is they do good work. So if they want to come back and ask for additional support, we're more than happy to look at their proposals.
Yeah, I would imagine in your area with the environment and that the outcomes become a really important part of. I mean, I guess that's for all of us, but the outcomes become, because with the environment, those outcomes take place over a long time horizon. And you're absolutely correct. I mean, that's the thing, especially with habitat improvement projects, you're sometimes you're not looking at, change, immediate change. And you're oftentimes looking at, a scale of a decade or more to see fundamental change in an aquatic environment or a terrestrial environment in the right direction. And so, yeah, we are very patient, and we understand that because we not only fund that kind of work, we actually go out and try to do that kind of work ourselves. So that long-term perspective is something we certainly understand. Thank you so much, Tim. Gina?
Yeah, we have a strong preference for multi-year grants, for multi-year general operating support. But I will say the funders in our community have had sort of, informal email exchanges about this, for what's your policy? And my response to my fellow funders is always, the nature of the nonprofit is that they will always be reliant on philanthropy. I think this question around what's your sustainability plan and how are you going to get off of our funding is just like the most ridiculous question. You need nonprofits and you need philanthropy as the system is currently structured, right? And so that's not going to be flipped in the next 3 years. So I think if we want to help them be sustainable and think about diversifying revenue and think about changing their models, they need that foundational support over a long time horizon so that they're not worried about the next grant cycle, always just racing for that next dollar. So we really love that. I personally, my experience has been oftentimes as boards. Now it's foundation boards that don't fully grasp the importance of those long horizons. And so I've been doing a lot of education with my own board about the importance of having those long relationships, and that it's okay. It's okay if they're relying on us. We're relying on them to deliver the service and deliver the amazing work that they do in the community. And so it's mutually beneficial that we're in a long-term relationship.
I love that. Thank you so much. Saul?
Yeah, we don't make multi-year grants, but we do fund organizations across multiple years. Actually, as we came out of the pandemic, and we sort of evolved our two sort of primary grant making cycles that each occur twice per year to the E-Town Innovations, which I mentioned before, and the other one was nonprofit growth and sustainability for that very reason. And if things are working and we let it go because of some arbitrary time-bound rule that we have, like what are we actually doing for our community? We need to really have, this perspective that, have to be careful because we have to raise money too, but like what donors might think of, how often they're giving money to a cause is less important than how people's lives who are on the other side of the equation are moving forward because of the work of this organization. So we let it go. We can't expect our community to be strong. And, that's what we're about, is a strong community. So that's always got to be the guiding light on when somebody comes for funding, regardless if it's an innovation or just sustaining, like, is this going to help the people? And if it does, let's give them the money and make it happen.
Thank you. So let's see. And there was one thing that kind of came up in Tim's conversation that I'd like to just lift up a little bit, because I think this certainly comes up in our trainings as well around outcomes. We're in applications. There's this question about, outcomes and evaluations and outputs and all of this kind of stuff. Like, what are you guys looking for? What in this sector that's changing, our environment is changing. We don't even know if we're going to be able to do our live programs, next year or whatever it is. When it comes to looking at outcomes, what kind of advice do you have for grant seekers about what your foundations are looking for in terms of outcomes? Gina, would you start us off this time?
Yeah, my advice would be really try and get clear on that with the foundation, because everyone is different. Unfortunately, we're not in a place yet where there's sort of a unified understanding of what's an appropriate amount of money for an outcome. The approach we have taken has changed over time. We recently went through a process with our local data center and worked with a group of our grantees who are all working on similar issues to see if we could collectively establish 3 metrics for organizations working on housing and 3 metrics for organizations working on community development, economic development, so that we're only asking them now to report on those metrics, so that we can start to see if there is some traction on those. And we did set the table so that there would be outputs and outcomes, but we really have learned, this could be a whole nother session about everything that we learned in 24 months. It's been very challenging, even though we did have our grantees help define the way that we were going to work and the metrics. Very imperfect. So I say we are very much still learning. We try really hard to say, this is the operating support we want to provide for you. Tell us what you're going to do. And then use that as our starting point for our conversation in most situations. So I would love to learn from others and hear nonprofits' perspectives on this sometime.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Saul?
Yeah, I would just say this is another area where we don't lean enough on the voice of community members who are impacted by the work. So, I spent a long time working for a national anti-poverty organization called LIFT. It's across a few cities in the country. And one of the things that we sort of found as we started to evolve our data is that actually the way people feel like they're doing in terms of stability and well-being and all these things are pretty highly correlated to how the sort of outcomes that we've shaped, for ourselves actually show that they're doing, which means that people know if their lives are better or not because of this support. And we too often, again, are taking the perspective of folks who give money into our foundations or endow our foundations about what like makes lives better. Folks who have maybe never lived in poverty or never had struggled with food insecurity, saying like, these are the kind of outcomes I want to see. And that's, you know, not wrong. If we're facing a societal problem, all of society needs to weigh in the solution, but we just often cut it off in terms of when we think that the people who are getting support from something that we fund can't give us what they want to be outcomes. And so we're still on that journey too. This is, you know, so this piece right here is like, this is just Saul's lens. This is not ECF's official stance, but I think we need to bring in community voice. We've been looking a lot into like, we have this word vibrant, a vibrant community in our mission statement. And I found, you know, some data on, it was like, I think the Arizona Town Hall has done these like this wheel of measures. And it's like, if things are looking good, you know, in each of these areas, then we have a healthy, strong and vibrant community. And like, can we start thinking about these measurements from a community-wide perspective rather than an organization by organization perspective, and then look at and then have sort of the basis for organizations sort of, you know, measures or outcomes be how they're feeding into this community-wide piece, because all of these challenges are so linked, right? Like, again, I worked on the south side of Chicago, and I know we're at the end of the hour, and I'm sorry, but like, you know, the violence is tied into food insecurity, into joblessness, into the you know, failing school systems and all these sort of things. Like, how do you say, well, we're going to work on this one thing and act like it's actually going to change how people's lives end up? It just doesn't work that way. Life is too dynamic for that. And so I think we need to think about outcomes being just as dynamic and just as intertwined as human lives are. That's what I would like to see from us. You know, I'm not the only one who makes that call, but I like to think I get a little influence. So I'm hoping we can drive ourselves in that direction in the coming years.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you. I appreciate that. Tim, if you have our final word on anything you want to add about outcomes and measurements evaluation.
Sure. You know, we ask the fish and deer in our neighborhood all the time if things are and we never get a satisfactory answer. So, you know, it's a little bit different in the environmental sector, especially around habitat improvement, and we rely heavily on photo point monitoring, ongoing surveys, land management partners who are able to monitor populations, wildlife and fish populations more adeptly than we can. And then we really heavily lean on the evaluatory process up front. You know, is this going to be a project that leads to good outcomes? And that is very much a qualitative judgment. It's hard to get a quantitative estimate out of that makes a lot of sense. So that's kind of where we're at. It's a little bit different for us. I would say that, you know, I spent a good majority of my career working in youth development, and there's a lot of focus, of course, and a lot of emphasis on outcomes there that are quantitative in nature, and also an unsatisfactory process from my perspective. So.
Yeah, it's evolving, which is there's really one thing that I'm appreciating from our conversation today from all of you is that I think, you know, probably because of the circumstances of the last several years, but this is the conversations that I'm having with Grantmakers, and it sounds like that you're having within the sphere of Grantmakers. It's more dynamic than it's been in years about how are we looking at things, what's the language and how we are describing it, the questions we're asking grantees, this word vibrant, what do we mean, how do we look at it? And so I'm really appreciating you know, the word that comes to my mind is the evolution of things in this sector, as you guys have described. So thank you. You know, we're at the top of the hour. We could easily kind of just keep going on any one of these questions. So I first want to thank our panelists, you know, Saul and Tim and Gina for being here, for the generosity of your time and really sharing about what you all are working with in your particular areas. I want to thank all of you all who are participating, all of your questions, really, you know, really thoughtful new questions that we haven't had in these funder panels before. So thank you so much for the questions, and apologies for the ones we weren't able to get to this time, but we're going to do another one, so come back. And of course, I want to thank our sponsors, Foundant and Grant Station and the Grantsmanship Center, for making it possible for us all to come together and have this rich conversation. All of you that have attended, you will get a follow-up email that will contain the link to the recording will be there, and some other good information about resources, etc. And then just to save the date, our very next Meet the Grantmaker panel, similar to this, but with new panelists, will be on Wednesday, April 13th. You'll get notification about that as well. So on behalf of the Grantsmanship Center, I just want to say thank you all for your attention and your participation. Best of luck to all of you.